Brendan O'Neill is the editor of Spiked and a columnist for The Australian and The Big Issue. Hello, Brendan.
Hi, Darren.
Brendan, we were just saying that lockdown for you must be a doddle, right? Because you must be used to just locking yourself away and writing for hours and hours on end.
Yeah, I do that quite a lot. I desperately miss pubs, though. I'm not sure how I've managed to go 8 weeks without visiting a pub. So there are big burdens in the lockdown. But for me, I'm one of the lucky ones, actually, because I do write a lot. I do sit at a desk a lot. The kind of people I'm worried about are, people in my family, friends of mine, people who have useful jobs, who work with their hands, who build things, who drive things. I'm really worried about those kinds of people because they simply cannot work. So for me, it's fairly easy. It's actually quite nice on some days, but I think for lots of people, it's probably a huge drag.
Exactly. I think all too often, it must be an undeniable truth that lockdown is a luxury, and it's a luxury that the middle classes are enjoying and higher income countries are enjoying at the expense of poorer, more vulnerable, less developed countries, isn't it? I think a good, really powerful illustration of this for me is the way in which trade unions and Labour politicians have argued against sending our nation's kids back to school, which makes me so unbelievably mad. How do you feel about that?
It's crazy. It's crazy. I thought the Labour Party was in favour of labour, in favour of people working for a living. Now you have a labour movement that wants to stop people from going back to work. Wants to stop teachers from going back to school, which is preventing children from getting an education and preventing the parents of young children from being able to go back to their jobs. And you have all these kind of middle class Corbynistas who are desperate to prevent the poor working class people from going to their jobs. And they think they're saving the working classes from death and destruction. But in fact, they're just demonstrating, their own snobbishness and elitism. And, the lockdown's fine for them because they're at home making their podcasts, making their sourdough bread, sending their emails, doing their jobs and all the other stuff that they do with gardens probably that they can sit in and relax. They're not thinking for 1 minute of the millions of people who have been prevented from working, who might live in small, cramped apartments or small houses, and who desperately want to go back into the world and feel useful again. So I think there's a really important class dynamic to the lockdown. I think the people who are enjoying it tend to be the quite privileged sections of society. And for everyone else, I think it was probably a burden from the very beginning, but certainly 8 or 9 weeks in, this is going to be looking to a lot of people like society has gone mad and they will be desperate to get back out into the world again.
I mean, if you look at the polling on this, the public is massively in support of the measures taken to freeze the economy and restrict their freedoms and liberties. I wonder, what explains that, do you think? What explains the public's desire to just hand their freedoms, their hard-won and cherished freedoms over on a silver platter almost to the government and say, please take my freedom away from me?
I find this absolutely fascinating and a little bit worrying. I think there's a couple of things in relation to this. The first is it's fascinating that, the chattering classes or the liberal elite or whatever we want to call them, it's fascinating that they are suddenly interested in public opinion. They haven't been interested in public opinion over the past 4 years when, the majority of the public were behind Brexit. And in fact, back then they were arguing that public opinion was ridiculous and brainwashed and full of idiocy and we shouldn't pay attention to it. We certainly shouldn't change the constitutional nature of the country in response to these thick, ignorant voters. So they were absolutely contemptuous of public opinion back then. And the striking thing about public opinion back then is that it was free and democratic, and it was given freely by people who were free individuals who took part in an open and fair referendum, who had their wits about them and who knew what was going on. When public opinion was freely expressed by an actual public, these people hated it. Now that public opinion is being expressed by a fractured public, by an atomized public, by people who have been essentially sent to their homes and put under a form of house arrest, they have no connection with anyone else. It's illegal to politically organize at the moment. It's illegal to have a political protest. People aren't in pubs or in workplaces, and we know that people tend to form their views in pubs and workplaces by speaking to others, by engaging in conversations, by engaging in arguments. So my view is that public opinion right now is not 100% trustworthy. I know that sounds like a bit of a sneaky get-out clause because the public happens to disagree with me at the moment. But and that's fine. The public often disagrees with me and others on many issues. But I genuinely think that it's a bit false to talk about public opinion when the public has been broken up. There is no public sphere. There is no place in which people can meet. There is no place in which people can talk. And if you think back to the Brexit period, the most wonderful thing about Brexit was that so many millions of people held on to their desire for Brexit, even in the face of the most deranged politics of fear in living memory. And the reason they were able to do that is because they had a public sphere. They were at work and they were talking to their friends. They were in pubs. They were going to marches and rallies in London and Manchester and other places around the country. So they derived strength and solidarity from being in those public arenas. What we have at the moment is something very, very different. People are not really allowed out. They're not allowed into any political situation. They're not allowed to gather in public. And I do think that atomizes people and breaks people down. So public opinion right now, I think, is really the fractured views of atomized individuals rather than being a genuine public sentiment.
You mentioned Brexit there and various rallies and the way in which we protested the fact that the political class of this country had really quite arrogantly chose to cast aside our vote for Brexit. I wonder what it was like for you, Brendan, sharing a stage with people like Nigel Farage. You know, you are someone who does identify with the left, who self-describes, I think you still do anyway, as a Marxist, right? And I wonder what that was like. It was sort of unholy alliance, basically, where people like Nigel and yourself are sharing a platform.
It was great. I really loved it. You know, this was the Leave Means Leave rally in London last year. Nigel Farage was there, and Richard Tice, and also Kate Hoey, Claire Fox, Paul Embury, a real spread of people from across the political spectrum. And of course, what tied us all together was a belief in democracy, because democracy comes before any other kind of politics. You can be on the right or the left. You can even be on the far left, in fact, and still believe in democracy, because democracy is the means through which politics is done. It's the means through which ordinary people are able to express themselves and express their interests and really, you know, give power to their beliefs and to their views. So it's something I think really worth defending, and it's worth setting up alliances to defend democracy. And I don't particularly mind who those alliances are with, so long as they are with people who believe in democracy. I think the important thing around that moment of the Leave Means Leave rally, it's really weird thinking back on it now, but people like me, and I'm sure you as well, and many others, we genuinely thought Brexit could be destroyed.
Absolutely.
We genuinely believed that if that happened, then the right to vote was essentially meaningless, because this was the largest vote in the history of this country. And we were really worried about what impact that would have on people, on democracy, and on politics. My view is that if Brexit had been successfully sidelined by the elites, then it would have harmed democracy and politics in this country for a generation. And so it was such an important issue. You know this better than most people. It was such an important issue to vote for in the first place, in my view, because the EU is a fairly rotten institution. But it was even more important once it had been voted for to ensure that it happened, because that became not simply about leaving the EU, which is important, but about defending British democracy itself. So any alliance that has the aim of defending democratic rights, the democratic rights of ordinary people, I think that's an alliance worth supporting.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm interested in exploring just briefly what sort of drives you, because when I think of Marxism and the platforms that you take, and by the way, I happen to agree with you, I think, more than most people on the conservative benches, which I find quite extraordinary, because I wouldn't associate that label, the label of Marxism, I associate with command from the centre. I associate with a small set of elites calling the shots. You know, that's what I associate when I think of the word Marxism. But you are the complete opposite of all of that, to the extent where I, who would describe myself as a old-fashioned conservative on the right, find myself in complete agreement with you on most issues. You know, how do we square that? What do you think it is? Do you think you're describing yourself in the right way, or
maybe you're not describing yourself in the right way? I think what it is, I think left and right are increasingly meaningless terms. Now, that's an easy thing to say, and many people say it. It's not an original idea at all. But I genuinely think we've moved on from that era. I think it was an incredibly important era. You know, politics was defined by left versus right. You know, right from the French Revolution onwards, which is where those terms come from. The radicals sat on the left side of the National Assembly, and the less radical people sat on the right side. Right from that moment in the late 1700s through to really the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1990, politics was defined by left versus right. So it was incredibly important, and you could tell a lot about people by how they described themselves, what ideas they held on to, and so on. I think a lot of that has changed. I think these categories have become increasingly meaningless. I think there are new divides now. Do you support democracy or do you not support democracy? Are you in favor of nationhood, or are you in favor of these kind of pseudo-cosmopolitan institutions like the European Union, which want to tell nations what they can do and what they can't do? Are you a populist or a technocrat? I think there are so many interesting new divides that have kind of exploded over the past 20 years, which I think are much more fruitful and much more useful in terms of how we describe ourselves. I also think, I say I'm a Marxist, or I used to be a Marxist. I mean, I don't really think that term has much meaning anymore. I don't think Marxism is coming back. It's like, when it comes to Marxism, I'm like people, I'm like, how people talk about rock bands when they say they like the early stuff. That's how I feel about left-wing politics. I like the very early stuff, kind of mid 1800s, when it was kind of radical, very democratic, very interested in freedom. People, if you read Karl Marx's defenses of press freedom, people are really surprised when they read them, because they are the best defenses of press freedom you will ever read. Or if you read Trotsky wrote some great stuff in the 1930s about the importance of press freedom and freedom of speech, and people are often surprised by that as well. I think what's happened to the left over the past few decades is that it has forgotten its origins, and its origins were fundamentally about democracy and giving ordinary people more power. That's why the left came into existence. It may have gone wrong quite early on, but it came into existence in order to ensure that ordinary working people had a voice in politics and had some power and influence in politics. The problem is that the left has completely lost sight of that. The left is now, I would say, the most anti-working class force in politics. It is intimately wedded to the state. It sees the state as the only agent of change rather than ordinary people whom it distrusts enormously. It's given up on the project of freedom and has become spectacularly illiberal and censorious. And it's given up on the project of economic growth, which was also a key component of the early left. And it now wraps itself around in the kind of Malthusian anti-growth politics of environmentalism. So, the old saying is, I didn't leave the left left me. And I feel that quite strongly. I don't think my views have changed very much. I'm still in favor of eradicating poverty via economic growth. I'm still in favour of freedom of speech and press freedom, and I'm still in favour of having as much democracy as humanly possible. I would consider all those to be, pretty standard, old-fashioned left-wing values, and they exist on the right too. It's the left that's changed. The left has become pro-state, anti-people, and very much in favour of censorship over public debate. So the left has lost its way to such an extraordinary degree. I don't think it can ever find its way back.
I mean, you mentioned there the idea that the state has just completely overtaken, it's become the only agent for change as far as in the eyes of the left. Do you think that explains the sort of cult-like status of the National Health Service? A lot of people say that with the decline of religion has meant that there's been a rise in an almost cult-like following for environmentalism and for the National Health Service. Would you agree with that, or
yes,
what? Yeah,
completely. Environmentalism, as far as I'm concerned, is like a fundamentalist religion. It has all the ingredients of a fundamentalist religion. It talks about the end of days, the end times that are coming soon, which will come about because of mankind's sinful behavior. We use so much carbon, we created such a large human footprint, and we will be punished for our sins by this kind of apocalyptic end of the world. It has all the ingredients of a kind of end of world religious cult. And now, of course, in Greta Thunberg, they have their kind of messiah-like figure who has come to tell us all about our wickedness and try and save us from our sins. And she does this by depriving herself of the luxuries of life and sailing across the Atlantic for 40 days and 40 nights. It wasn't quite 40 days and 40 nights, but it has all these biblical undertones, and the rest of us are just supposed to kind of self-flagellate for our terrible, sinful, greedy behaviour, which, by the way, only means things like owning a car and wanting to go on holiday and wanting to have quite a nice, comfortable life. That's now seen as completely sinful and wicked. So environmentalism is entirely religious, in my view. And with the NHS, I just think the worship of the NHS is completely bizarre and really destructive. This is a health service. It's supposed to serve the public when we are ill. It's not something that we are supposed to serve. We're not supposed to bow down before it and bow and scrape and worship and pray at the altar of the NHS. That's completely surreal. And I think during the coronavirus crisis, we've seen how problematic that view is, because we now have this new mantra of protect the NHS, which basically means protecting the NHS from us, from people, from the public. So you have this new public service ethos, which is actually about protecting services from the public, which runs counter to the entire idea of the NHS, which is that it was a service that would serve the public. So this kind of religious atmosphere around the NHS, I just think, is incredibly creepy and backward, and it really should be brought to an end.
Something I found really creepy as well would be, I think, the fact that we've seen police forces around the country abusing powers they've been offered during this crisis. And I'd argue every organ of the state really has been found to be wanton to a large extent. I mean, Public Health England has clearly been far too centralised and bureaucratic, and the police have had a really terrible war, if we want to be as dramatic as branding this a war as most commentators seem to do. But what do you think? Do you think the police will be able to rebuild their reputation very quickly after their disgraceful and quite excessive behaviour throughout COVID-19?
I think it will be very difficult for them to rebuild their reputation. I think they've behaved terribly. Not all police forces, but many of them have behaved terribly. They've kind of embraced this new authority they have. They've embraced it with a certain amount of relish. And I've witnessed the police doing some outrageous things, like throwing homeless people out of parks, even though homeless people don't have anywhere else to go. I've seen them breaking up picnics. I've seen them tell a young kid, 3 or 4 years old, that he can't play football with his dad. really excessive, ridiculous stuff. And of course, they've also used drones to film people walking in the Peak District. They've stopped people in the street and asked them what they've been shopping for. I mean, it is ridiculous. And the worrying thing is that they've taken to this new role with too much ease. It's almost like they were waiting for this to happen so they could, let their busybody instincts run riot. So that has worried me enormously. I think they've got a lot of work to do to recover their reputation. I think it's fascinating that I think every single fine brought under the Coronavirus Act, or certainly a lot of them, have now just been wiped aside by the Crown Prosecution Service because they were either wrongly given or excessive or shouldn't have been done in the first place. So the police have behaved terribly. So have many other wings of the state, as it happens. And one of the reasons I have been challenging Boris bashing over this period is not because I think Boris has done a wonderful job. I think he's done an okay job. And not because I support the lockdown, I don't. But I think this obsessive focus on Boris and his alleged failures, particularly from the media, just distracts attention from the broader problem of the state and this sclerotic, bureaucratic machine that the state has become over the past 30 or 40 years. All these different wings of the state that don't speak to each other. They don't know what they're doing. They don't even have protective equipment because they're not communicating properly. And it really makes you realize that Dominic Cummings was actually correct when he said they wanted to overhaul the civil service and overhaul the state. And when he said that a few months back, at the end of last year, he got so much flack from the media who said, leave it alone, it's fine. Well, now we know it's not fine. And I think there are lots of layers of the state that will need to be rethought and reworked in order to make the state more efficient and less interventionist in people's lives.
I agree. I mean, what do you think, Brendan, explains what can only be described as a Hampstead circle jerk from our metropolitan Liberals over Jacinda Ardern? Instead of focusing on the issues that you've just set out very eloquently, all of those issues that could require a little bit of journalistic prodding and probing to find out just what the hell's gone wrong. Instead, we get the Prime Minister of New Zealand held up as some form of deity in a country that has more sheep than it does people. What the hell is going on there?
It's completely surreal. The idea that you can compare the UK to New Zealand when it comes to COVID-19 is just completely bonkers. I can't, when I see people doing this, I almost can't believe it. New Zealand doesn't even have 5 million people in it. London has almost twice the number that New Zealand has. So there are vastly more people in the UK. London, of course, is a global hub. It's got a very large migrant communities, and we know that migrant communities often have higher incidences of the comorbidities that make COVID-19 worse. London has dense population levels. So the UK and London are very different to most other places in Europe, in fact, never mind New Zealand, which is slightly larger than the UK, but has fewer than 5 million people. As you say, it has more sheep than human beings. It's very sparsely populated. Mm-hmm. And so they hold up Jacinda Ardern as this kind of saintly woman, this wonderful goddess who saved the New Zealand people from death and disease and destruction just by being so wonderful. Whereas Boris, because he's an evil, bumbling clown, led us all into this nightmare that we're currently living in. It's just a fairy tale. It is a fairy tale that the liberal elite tells themselves to make themselves feel better about the fact that they have utterly failed to connect with ordinary British people over the past 5 to 10 years, and that British people don't tend to vote for the parties they represent or vote for the ideas that they like. So they look to Jacinda Ardern, just as they have previously done with Justin Trudeau. They look to them as their kind of fantasy leader, this wonderful, saintly, liberal figure who we wish was leading our country. It's utterly infantile. It's utterly childish. It's an avoidance of reality, and it's just utter myth making about COVID-19 and why it hit Britain in a different way to how it hit New Zealand. Anyone who is honest with themselves will know that that's because Britain and New Zealand are very different countries, not because Britain is run by Boris and New Zealand is run by Jacinda Ardern. So they're just lying. And it's a comfort blanket they wrap around themselves because they can't handle reality.
Well, speaking of a middle class out of touch response, you're brilliant on exposing the eco warriors who I think at the minute are absolutely loving this. If you look at all of the headlines, these are the same people that want to increase the price of food, clothing and footwear that disproportionately hits the poorest in society to achieve their ends. But they're excited about the fact that global GDP might shrink twice the rate seen in the Great Recession. This may be the worst hit to British people's livelihoods since the Great Depression of the 1930s, but still, Brendan, the Greenies are celebrating the fact that this is all it took to achieve their ambitions around carbon emissions to a level seen as acceptable by our eco overlords. I mean, all it took was to lock billions of us indoors, destroy our livelihoods and freedoms, and that's hardly a vote-winning prospectus, is it, Brendan?
I doubt it very much.
I bloody hope not, anyway.
I hope not. You're absolutely right. They see this as the world they've always wanted to create. There are fewer flights, hardly any flights. There's less travel because people aren't allowed to travel. There's less work because people aren't allowed to work. There's less production. And they are actually cheering this on. They're saying, this proves that we can live in a lower carbon world. This proves we can live in a less work intensive world. And this proves we can live with less production and less consumption. But as you say, this has been brought about by the destruction of liberty, the forcing of vast numbers of people, not just in the UK, but around the world, into a form of house arrest, and the devastation of economic life. Nothing makes me more angry than these kind of middle class, usually quite well off Western Greens who think what's currently happening is lovely or interesting or a sign of things to come. It's such a first world view. Because, let's leave to one side the fact that, lots and lots of people in the UK are going to lose their jobs. Millions of people in America have already lost their jobs. Far worse than that is what's going to happen in the developing world. More than 100 million people in India are at risk of losing their livelihoods. The International Labour Organization predicts that 1.6 billion people around the world will lose some of their work as a result of COVID and the lockdowns. The UN is predicting a hunger catastrophe because economic production has been brought to a standstill. Food isn't being produced, food isn't being transported, wealth is not being created. If this is the world Greens want, they are psychopaths. They are misanthropes. They are not thinking about the right of people to survive from one day to the next, and the right of people less fortunate of them to have enough food to eat, to have a job to go to, and to have a house to live in. So I actually think, if we think about this in a bit of detail, the fact that some Greens are celebrating the COVID moment and saying this shines the light towards a new way of living really demonstrates how unhinged they have become, and how this kind of sociopathic selfishness they have, where so long as they can breathe a bit of clean air as they walk through Primrose Hill or cycle through Hampstead, then they're happy. They don't care about working class people losing their jobs, people losing their homes, or people around the world going hungry. It's deranged, and I think it's a really important time to call out just how backward the green outlook is, and to make the point that what humanity really needs is more growth in order that we can liberate more people from poverty. 3 billion human beings still live in a form of poverty. And I think humanity should devote its resources to working out how to liberate those people from poverty rather than making the planet a greener place to the satisfaction of rich people like George Monbiot. And that really ought to be our focus for the next few years.
Well, I think that's right. And I think you put that really well, because if you just think about the hypocrisy of people like Monbiot, he can afford to take the economic hit. He can still afford to, if we apply really large punitive taxation to things like flights, so that only the super rich can afford to fly, to drive in a car, so only those who can afford to can drive a car. Even buying meat, that is their aim, to ensure that we do not eat meat. We cannot afford to eat meat. It's all right for them, of course, because they can take the financial hit, but for those at the bottom, these things will become luxury items in this green utopia. And there has to be an element of class warfare to all of this, doesn't there?
Absolutely. I've thought for a very long time that environmentalism is a form of class warfare. And it's not surprising at all that if you ever go on a climate change demo, or if you ever speak to environmentalists, they're always very middle class. They're often quite posh, in fact. Someone like Monbiot, privately educated, comes from a kind of, borderline aristocratic background. Of course, there are people like Prince Charles. There are, the upper echelons of the green movement tend to be stuffed with people who come from incredibly wealthy backgrounds. And the policies that they promote would hit working people and poorer people harder than anyone else. That's the case in the UK, where I think, the idea of eco taxes, or making it more expensive to drive, making it more expensive to buy certain meat products and everything else, or making it very difficult to fly. Extinction Rebellion wants to add punitive taxes to flights in order that fewer people will be able to fly. Well, of course, all that will mean is that the rich will fly and the poor won't. And less well-off people have only really been flying for about 30 years or so, with the dawn of cheap flights in particular. That's really when, people like my parents, who never flew anywhere until about 1991, 1992, that's really when lots of less well-off people started flying. And of course, cheap flights completely horrify the green elites, and they want them to be brought to a halt. So all of their policies would have an incredibly punitive impact on less well-off people who work hard for a living, who deserve some of these luxuries, in my view. And they would have an even worse impact around the world. The idea of sustainable development, for example. Sustainable development is one of those buzz phrases that it's very hard to oppose, because, who would argue for unsustainable development? But what it really means is developing in such a way that you don't really grow in a meaningful way. Your economy doesn't grow in a meaningful way. It's all very small. It's all very timid. There's no real industrialization. There's no real economic growth. And, it's all very well for people in the West, where we've been through the Industrial Revolution, to say that people in the developing world shouldn't go through the same process. But the truth is, they need to. If we are serious about bringing people in the developing world onto the same level of us, so they have equality of opportunity and equality of wealth, then they do need to grow, they do need progress, they do need modernity. And we should support them when they try and get those things. But what the Greens do is stand in their way. So it's an incredibly cruel movement, in my view. It's a very anti-human movement. It's very misanthropic, and it's very self-centered. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things that frustrates me, going back to your earlier question about left versus right. I always find it so frustrating when environmentalism is seen as a left-wing ideal, because, again, going back to Marx was a stinging critic of Thomas Malthus. Malthus, in many ways, was the first environmentalist. Mm-hmm. He was a population scaremonger who said that people would die because we wouldn't be able to create enough food and so on. He was completely wrong. And And Marx said that those kinds of ideas were a libel against the human race. And he said that humanity has it within its power to push forward, to create more stuff, to create more food, and to liberate people from poverty. So those old, very old left-wing ideas have been completely forgotten. And these new, backward, miserablist, anti-human ideas have taken their place. I really hope at some point the young generation in particular, who at the moment are very enamored with environmentalism and tend to worship people like Greta Thunberg, I hope at some point there will come a form of rebellion and a kickback and a realization that this politics is standing in the way of human progress.
Yeah, well, we can hope. Brendan, if we turn to Scotland, just what the hell is going on in Scotland? It's not the first time I've said that, admittedly, but why is there not any... I think, as far as the press is concerned in the United Kingdom, I have just spent the last, 40 minutes slagging them off, but at least we have a press in this country that seems to want to at least attempt to hold the government to account, and opposition MPs who seem to want to hold the government to account. In Scotland, there doesn't appear to be any of that. I mean, we've had quite a liberal, authoritarian attempt to create a dislocation between thought and speech in an attempt to eliminate incorrect thinking. Immediately, I've got alarm bells running off in my head as soon as someone says something like that. With a new hate crime bill, but there doesn't appear, I did a Google search, there doesn't appear to be any really deeply considered opposition or pushback from the press in this country, or rather in Scotland. And I'm wondering what the hell's going on.
Yeah, I'm so worried about Scotland. I love Scotland. I think Scotland is an amazing country. I've been there many, many times. I know lots of people in Scotland. It's a great place. The tragedy is that it's currently being ruled by an incredibly authoritarian party, the SNP, and an incredibly authoritarian First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. And these people are a pox on Scottish politics, as far as I'm concerned. And I really hope the Scottish people push back against them at some point soon. What Nicola Sturgeon has done, she has turned Scotland into a laboratory of authoritarian ideas. She has made Scotland into one of the most authoritarian countries in Western Europe. I mean, some of their policies are utterly bonkers. They wanted to push through something called the named persons scheme, which is where every single child born in Scotland would have had a state overseer, so someone in the state who would have looked after them, kept a file, made sure they were okay all through childhood until they became adults. Completely and utterly Orwellian. And then there was the Offensive Chants at Football Act, which essentially outlawed football chants and football songs, and people were arrested for singing certain songs or making certain chants in football stadiums, where it's traditionally been accepted that the crowd is rowdy and stirred up and having fun and say things that they wouldn't normally say in everyday life, and it's usually been seen as fine. But in Scotland, for a while, it was an arrestable offence to say something offensive at a football game. And now there is this hate speech bill, which would really ramp up the kind of hate speech legislation we have around the UK, all of which I think is deeply problematic, which outlaws grotesquely offensive commentary or ideas and arguments that offend or undermine certain protected groups, certain religious groups, certain racial groups. And Scotland is really just now wants to take that a step further and outlaw all forms of hateful content. And what's really shocking is that the draft bill that they're pushing through even stipulates that a playwright, I don't know why they single out playwrights, but it even stipulates that a playwright could potentially be arrested for writing or sharing hateful content. So, art itself could fall under the kind of censorious oversight of Nicola Sturgeon and her authoritarian minions. So they've really turned Scotland into this unpleasantly illiberal place, and the media in Scotland and also the media in the UK, much of which loves Nicola Sturgeon, they're just not as critical of her as they would be of someone like Boris Johnson. They give her a completely free ride. And in fact, if any journalist criticises her, as the BBC's Sarah Smith did recently, by saying that she's enjoying the lockdown and the opportunity it's giving her to distinguish Scotland from England, anyone who says that will just be rounded upon by all the kind of, slightly crazy Scottish nationalists on Twitter, stirred up by Nicola Sturgeon herself. And the media will side with Nicola Sturgeon against the journalist, which is the complete opposite of what they would do with Boris Johnson. So there's a real lack of criticism about what is happening in Scotland. And I think we should pay more attention, because Scotland, as democratically, is a part of the United Kingdom. It's a part of our country. We should be very interested in what's happening there. And we should be far more critical of any attempt to prevent Scottish people from having the same freedoms that we do.
And also find it just really deeply depressing that a country that gave us Adam Smith, etc., is turning into a one-party state with very little pushback.
Yes, if you walk through Edinburgh, as I've done many times, or Glasgow, these were hotbeds of liberal thought, radical ideas, Enlightenment ideas. Scotland was absolutely key to the Enlightenment. It had some of the greatest thinkers, some of the greatest ideas came from Scotland, and they influenced the world. And it's a real shame that under the SNP and because of the SNP, it now has an unenlightened political system and an unenlightened approach to freedom and openness and debate and reason. I think Nicola Sturgeon has turned Scottish politics into a really illiberal phenomenon. So it's a great shame. Scotland contributed an absolutely disproportionate amount of ideas and enlightened thinking to recent world history. Now, the fact that it's now been run by this kind of petty nationalist authoritarian woman who has very little tolerance for alternative ways of thinking, I think that's a real shame.
Absolutely. So I posted on Twitter and I said, what should I ask? I'm interviewing Brendan O'Neill later, what should I ask him? And everyone came in with the SNP, because I think everyone who cares about liberty is quite upset about this, but it just so happens there aren't that many of us who care about genuine liberty, Brendan. But I was also asked to ask you about everything that's going on in the English Channel at the moment. Now, do you think that this country needs to be a little bit more like Australia in our response to tackling the migration crisis at the English Channel? Because actually I think the so-called liberal, or I would argue the bastardization of the word liberal response, is actually meaning that people are being encouraged to pay people traffickers, people smugglers. People are being encouraged to make the perilous journey, thinking, oh, these kind-hearted liberals say, we should just welcome people like me. I should just be accepted into British life despite not using any legal route to enter it. What's your view on that? Where are you at?
I think it's really worrying. I've always taken a very liberal approach to immigration. I've always been in favour of immigration. I've been in favour of people wanting to move countries. I've been in favour of countries saying, listen, we need these kinds of workers, we need these kinds of people. Why don't you consider coming to us and learning a trade or learning a profession and becoming part of our nation? I've always thought that's been quite a positive human impulse. My parents are immigrants. They came from Ireland. They came to the UK to work. I'm a first generation Briton, so I'm incredibly new in this country. Immigration's great. Immigration can be an incredibly positive force, both for the country that's receiving the immigrants and, of course, for the immigrants themselves. But it has to be something that's done in a rational, reasoned, legal way. What we ought to have is a situation where a nation will say, listen, we need you guys from Poland or Bangladesh or other countries to do certain jobs and to fulfill certain positions, and this is what we're going to offer you. we can't have a situation where people are just leaking through the borders, because that undermines borders. I think it's dangerous for the people who are doing the travelling themselves, who put themselves at enormous risk. And I think it is so deeply cynical of liberals to celebrate that kind of movement, because, as you say, they're given a green light to very dangerous, reckless forms of behaviour, where large numbers of people travel in unsafe conditions because they've essentially been given a green light by the liberal elite, who say, come here, this is great, we love it. And they put themselves at danger as a consequence of that. My great issue with immigration over the past few years is the way in which it's been removed from the sphere of democracy. And that's why, even though I am generally a free movement kind of person, I was completely opposed to the European Union's freedom of movement, because it was a completely undemocratic idea. And if Britain is going to have open borders and the free movement of workers, that's something that should be put to the British people, that they should be consulted on, and that they should have the right to vote on. That's a basic principle of democracy, that if your country changes in a dramatic way, you have to have the right to express your opinion, and you have to have the right to determine whether it should happen or whether it shouldn't happen. And so I think it's, if you look at the kind of the Ashcroft polls that came out on the day of the Brexit referendum, it's really interesting, because the number one reason Leave voters gave for voting Leave is because they think British laws should be made in Britain. And the second reason was because they wanted controls on immigration. And Remainers used this as proof that we're all racist scumbags. But in fact, those two ideas are very closely related. Mm-hmm. If you want British laws to be made in Britain, that means you're a Democrat. If you want more control and say over immigration, that means you're a Democrat. I think those two things are very closely linked. What I find fascinating is that, you know, every serious survey shows that British people in the round do not have a prejudiced view of immigrants. They don't hate immigrants. They actually value immigrants, and we have a higher view of immigrants than most other European countries. Yeah. But what people want is the right to talk about this, the right to discuss it, and the right to cast votes on the question of what happens at our borders, what movements of people we should accept, what movements of people we require. I think that's really what the immigration issue was about in relation to Brexit. So when I see the English Channel stuff, I just find that deeply, deeply concerning, because I know it will be used by liberal elites as a way of saying, you know, pity these poor immigrants, we have to let them in, which gives the green light to more and more forms of dangerous travel. And I know it will be used as a stick with which to beat Brexit Britain and all the racists that apparently live here, which is completely untrue. So I really think one of the key ideas behind Brexit is that a nation has to be able to protect its own borders. A nation has to be able to make decisions democratically about issues like immigration. And I think the liberal elite really ought to respect those democratic ideals, rather than cynically using illegal immigration to undermine Brexit, to undermine democracy, and to virtue signal, essentially, about how nice they are in comparison to everyone else.
Well, exactly. I think it's very easy for these people in their Hampstead mansions to be pro-illegal immigration when their idea of being, exposed to migrant workers is either through picking up their coffee or their cleaners every week. You know, I find these people deeply, deeply cynical. But I wonder, you mentioned there being able to even just talk about immigration. Do you think 10 years on from Duffygate, when Gordon Brown called Gillian Duffy a bigoted woman for daring to raise concerns which she did around integration into society of very large numbers of Europeans to this country, do you think that's got better, Brendan, or do you think actually it's got worse, where we are still called racist, bigoted, you name it?
That's a really good question. I think it might be I think it's got better in the sense that the public has reasserted its democratic rights in an incredibly dramatic way. Via Brexit, we have rejected the European Union, and we have demanded more democracy and a greater say in how this country is run. So as a consequence of that, I think it's become a bit more difficult to say that immigration should be taken off the table and it should be decided above our heads by technocrats or bureaucrats or whatever else it might be. So it's got better in that sense. We have, through sheer force of our votes, through sheer force of democracy, we have forced the immigration question back into the democratic sphere where it belongs, with all the other questions about political life, whether it's health, the economy, or anything else. All of this stuff should be subject to public discussion, public deliberation, and democratic voting. So it's got better in the sense that we have successfully wrested the immigration question away from Brussels and back towards Westminster. But it's got worse in the sense that, as you all know, the liberal elites responded to Brexit by going completely and utterly mad. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. They lost the plot. Because, we have to remember, of course, that these are the kinds of people who come from nice backgrounds, are usually very middle class and very well connected, often went to the right schools and the right universities. These people are used to getting their way. They always get their way, particularly in politics. So for the first time in a long time, via the vote for Brexit, they didn't get their way and they could not cope with the situation. So they went completely mad. And madness is really the only way to describe it. I think people sometimes forget how unhinged the past 4 years of British politics have been, and the deranged stories that were being pushed forward as part of Project Fear, the absolutely poisonous things that were being said about ordinary voters, the way in which Corbynistas just looked upon working class voters in particular as essentially a scum. And that really was the undertone of so much of this discussion. It was a real rehabilitation of the kind of Victorian view of poor people and working people as essentially scumbags. And so as a consequence of that, the racism accusation and the fascism accusation got ramped up even more and more and more. So, during the past 3 or 4 years, we've been told often that, we have helped to propel Britain into a fascist future. We are responsible for every hate crime that occurs. We've made immigrants feel unwelcome. All these lies that have been told about Brexit voters for the past 4 years. So I think in answer to your question, I think it's got better on one level because the British people, being very patient and very democratic and very reasonable, have brought immigration and other questions back into the democratic sphere. So Brexit was, I've always argued, a historic leap forward for British democracy. I think it is right up there with the great struggles for democracy in the past, from the Levellers during the Civil War through to the Chartists in the 1840s and the suffragettes in the 1910s. I think Brexit is in keeping with those great democratic traditions. But as a consequence, the liberal elite, who for the first time ever really did not get their way, they went mad and they accused us of being fascists and Nazis and worse than Nazis, according to David Lammy when he was talking about the European Research Group. So it's got better in some ways and worse in others. And I think it's something that we've got to keep a really close eye on and just make sure that ordinary people are not defamed as racists, because that is one of the most obnoxious parts of British politics at the moment. It's completely unacceptable. It's completely untrue. I think lots of people find it deeply upsetting to be called racist all the time. And I think anything we can do to ensure that happens less and less, I think is very important.
Brendan, I wonder, and this will be the last question, but I wonder, are you optimistic about our future? Now, I say that as someone who recognises how the last 4 years have been for many voters and those who had the temerity to win the Leave election. But if we think back to, we had the 2017 to 2019 Parliament, which in my view, definitely in living memory, has to be the worst Parliament to ever disgrace this country and its democratic history, proud democratic history. But we saw the British people stand up to them and say, you know what, mate, sod off. I am not going to be called bigoted. I am not going to be called racist. I am not going to let you trash my vote. I am not going to let you look at me in the eye, swear that you would respect my vote for Brexit, the biggest vote for anyone or anything, and then do everything you could behind the scenes to overturn and manipulate that outcome. And actually, the British people gave Boris Johnson an absolutely stonking majority in areas where the Tories used to think they would never, ever be able to get close to winning elections. And I actually, Brendan, for I think the first time since 2016, felt incredibly proud of my country. You know, this little old island that Emma Thompson called a miserable grey rock actually stood up to those, I was about to swear there, I won't swear, and said, I'm not going to be hectored and belittled by you people. I'm going to stand up and be counted. My vote does matter. My voice does matter. I have purchase in society. And I felt really, really quite optimistic about that and about my country's future. I want to know whether you are, or whether or not COVID has completely ruined that for you.
Well, I agree with everything you've just said completely, 100%. If you'd asked me that question of whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic a few months ago, I would have been leaping around in unbridled optimism. So COVID has shaken things a little bit, because the speed with which our civil liberties have been taken away and democratic debate has been pushed aside, and the country has become, a bit of a fearful, atomized, quite depressing place. That worries me enormously. And one of the reasons I want us to get out of lockdown and to get out of this funk as quickly as possible is precisely so that we can go back to that great optimistic moment of recent times, where people asserted their democratic rights, asserted their freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, and changed this nation in an incredibly radical, brilliant, stirring way. So the sooner we get back to that view of Britain and ordinary people's role in it, the better. But, on Brexit, I completely share your view. It's in my view, it's the best thing to happen in British politics for decades and decades. And I think it was incredibly important as a means of reasserting the right of ordinary people to determine the destiny of the nation they live in. And all the wonderful things that have happened in Britain over the past 300 or 400 years have really been about ordinary people saying, can we have a bit more say? Can we have a bit more influence? You've got to listen to us. There have been so many positive leaps forward as a consequence of that attitude amongst ordinary people. And I think Brexit was one of the most important one of those leaps forward. The thing that impressed me most about Brexit, and I still marvel at this sometimes, I still smile as I'm walking down the street when I remember it, is the fact that people stuck with Brexit even through Project Fear. So we voted for it in 2016, and almost instantly the establishment turned against it, particularly, as you say, the 2017 to 2019 Parliament, a Remainer Parliament in a Brexit country, doing everything they could to stitch up our votes and to overthrow the democratic vote for Brexit. Through all of that, through a constant daily media barrage of ridiculous scare stories about how Britain was going to be destroyed by Brexit, through all of that, people held on to their desire for Brexit to happen and voted for Boris Johnson in historic numbers to ensure that it did happen. That level of commitment, that level of reason, that level of refusing to be cowed by hysteria, refusing to bow down to the fear-mongering middle classes or the fear-mongering media, that is so incredibly admirable and actually demonstrates that democracy works, because ordinary people can think for themselves. They aren't easily brainwashed. They are capable of standing up for their rights and asserting their rights. And I think that's such an important lesson. It's worth us taking forward. Just to come back to Marxism very briefly, there was a Trinidadian Marxist called C.L.R. James, one of the great authors of the 20th century. And he said, when people look back on the 20th century, it won't be the wildness and the rebelliousness of ordinary people that they will be impressed by. It will be the patience. It will be the way in which ordinary people very often patiently argued for change and patiently waited for change. And I think Brexit sums that up perfectly. We didn't go crazy. We didn't lose our minds. We just used our votes to change Britain for the better. And I think as soon as we can get back to the democratic project and push aside the COVID crisis, I think Britain really can move into a wonderful new era.
That was a beautifully optimistic way to end it, despite all the misery that we're currently living through. So thank you very much, Brendan O'Neill.
Thanks, Darren.
Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that that was absolutely fantastic and fascinating, and hopefully you'll leave on a cheerier note than when we went into it talking about COVID. So do hit that subscribe button and the little notification bell so you don't miss out on any future updates. Thank you. See you next time. Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that relies on support from people like yourself who want us to continue producing our free-thinking, high-quality content. You can rest assured whatever you donate, big or small, will be put back into ensuring we win the battle of ideas. Thank you for your support.